February 1942. The Pacific is burning. Japan has conquered an empire in just 3 months. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies. Their military seems unstoppable. The rising sun flag flies over territories spanning thousands of miles. But on one tiny speck of land, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 28 Australian soldiers are about to write one of the most astonishing chapters in military history. For 77 days, these men, outnumbered more than 100 to 1, will hold off an entire Japanese invasion force. They will fight with outdated weapons, dwindling supplies, and no hope of reinforcement. They will face naval bombardments, air raids, and wave after wave of enemy soldiers. This is the story of the Siege of Rabaul. No, this is the story of the men who refused to surrender when surrender was the only rational choice. This is the story of Lark Force, the Coastwatchers, and a defense so stubborn, so brilliant, so absolutely desperate that it changed the course of the Pacific War. Rabaul. Before the war, it's a sleepy Australian colonial town on the northeastern tip of New Britain Island in Papua New Guinea. Palm trees sway over pleasant harbors. Settlers sip tea on verandas. The town sits inside the caldera of an extinct volcano. Its harbor, one of the finest natural anchorages in the Pacific. It's beautiful, peaceful, strategic. And that's exactly why Japan wants it. December 7th, 1941. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and unleashes a tidal wave of conquest across Asia and the Pacific. Within weeks, Japanese forces are driving south, island hopping toward Australia. Rabaul sits directly in their path. A perfect staging base for air operations, naval operations, and eventually, the planned invasion of Australia itself. The Australian government knows Rabaul is doomed. They send a garrison anyway, Lark Force. That's the code name for the 1,400 Australian soldiers dispatched to defend Rabaul in 1941. They're mostly from the 2/20 Battalion, inexperienced militia troops with minimal training. Their equipment is outdated. Their aircraft, a handful of obsolete Wirraway fighters, are no match for Japanese Zeros. Their coastal artillery can't cover all approaches to the harbor. They know they're being sent to a death trap. They go anyway. Among them are men who will become legends. Men like Lieutenant Colonel John Scanlon, the commanding officer who will be court-martialed for retreating. Men like Captain David Hutchinson Smith, who will organize the Coastwatcher network, and scattered across the jungle, small groups of soldiers who will refuse to accept defeat. January 23rd, 1942. Just before dawn. The Japanese strike. The Japanese Fourth Fleet's South Seas Force descends on Rabaul like a hammer. Waves of bombers from the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the same carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, obliterate the town's defenses. The few Australian Wirraway fighters that managed to take off are shot down within minutes. Japanese Zero pilots report the kills with contempt. It's barely combat, more like target practice. Then the invasion fleet arrives. 5,000 Japanese soldiers of the South Seas Detachment storm ashore at multiple beaches. They're veterans of the China campaign, experienced, well-equipped, ruthless. The Australian defenders fight desperately, but they're overwhelmed in hours. By nightfall on January 23rd, Rabaul has fallen. The Japanese raise their flag over the smoldering town. Most of the Australian garrison is killed, captured, or scattered into the jungle. The battle is over. Or so the Japanese think. What the Japanese don't realize is that hundreds of Australian soldiers have escaped into the dense jungle of New Britain. Small groups, moving through the bush, avoiding Japanese patrols, trying to reach the southern coast, where they hope, pray, that rescue ships might arrive. Among these scattered survivors is a group that will become known as the Toll Plantation Party. About 160 men initially, led by Major Owen, gathering at Toll Plantation south of Rabaul. They're exhausted, low on ammunition, and hunted by thousands of Japanese troops systematically sweeping the island. But rescue isn't coming. The Australian Navy, already stretched thin across the Pacific, can't risk ships in waters dominated by Japanese air power. The men are on their own. Most of the survivors eventually surrender or are captured. On July 1st, 1942, in one of the war's most horrific atrocities, Japanese soldiers will march over 1,000 Australian and Indian prisoners of war to the sea at Toll Plantation and machine gun them to death. It becomes known as the Toll Plantation Massacre, one of the worst war crimes against Australian forces in history. But some men don't surrender. Some men vanish into the jungle and keep fighting. Among them, a group of approximately 28 soldiers who will conduct one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns of World War II. The exact number fluctuates. Some accounts say 23, others 31, but around 28 men form the core of this resistance force. They're not special forces. They're not commandos. They're ordinary infantry soldiers, some barely out of their teens, who simply refuse to quit. And they're about to become the Japanese garrison's worst nightmare. To understand how 28 men held off thousands, you must understand the Coastwatchers, one of World War II's most critical and least known intelligence networks. The Coastwatcher organization was created before the war by Australian Navy Lieutenant Commander Eric Felt. His idea was simple but brilliant. Station observers on remote Pacific islands with radio equipment. If Japan invades, these men stay behind enemy lines, hiding in the jungle, reporting on Japanese ship and aircraft movements. It sounds like a suicide mission. It basically is. After Rabaul falls, several Coastwatcher stations remain operational across New Britain and surrounding islands. These men, Australian soldiers, plantation owners, missionaries, indigenous scouts, hide in the jungle with bulky teleradio sets, powered by hand-cranked generators. Every day, they risk everything to transmit intelligence reports to Allied headquarters. Their motto, borrowed from the Gospel of Isaiah, "They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles." Admiral William Bull Halsey will later write, "The Coastwatchers saved Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal saved the Pacific." And on New Britain, a small group of these Coastwatchers and soldiers merge into a single fighting unit, the 28 men who will hold off the Japanese for 77 days. Their leader varies by account, but several names appear repeatedly in the records. Captain David Hutchinson Smith, a Coastwatcher coordinator. Private William Bill Harry, a scout. Sergeant Tom Axford, an infantry veteran, and crucially, indigenous Papua New Guinean scouts and guides whose knowledge of the jungle terrain proves invaluable. Together, they establish hidden camps deep in the interior of New Britain. They cache supplies. They study Japanese patrol patterns. They prepare ambush sites. And then they start fighting back. March 1942. The Japanese have controlled Rabaul for over a month. They're building it into a fortress, the linchpin of their defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. Engineers are constructing airfields, supply depots, barracks for thousands of troops. Cargo ships arrive daily. The harbor fills with warships. Rabaul is becoming Japan's most important base outside the home islands. And every night, small groups of Australian soldiers emerge from the jungle to disrupt, sabotage, and kill. Their tactics are classic guerrilla warfare: hit fast, hit hard, disappear before the enemy can respond. A Japanese patrol marching down a jungle trail suddenly comes under rifle fire from concealed positions. Several soldiers fall. The Australians vanish into the bush before reinforcements arrive. A supply dump on the outskirts of Rabaul explodes in flames, fuel barrels, ammunition crates, all destroyed. Guards report seeing shadows moving through the trees. But when they search, they find nothing. Japanese sentries at forward positions are found dead at their posts. Throats cut, weapons missing. The attacks are silent, professional, terrifying. The Japanese commander in Rabaul, Major General Tomataro Hori, is furious. He orders sweeps through the jungle. He sends out hundreds of soldiers to find and destroy these guerrillas. He places bounties on their heads. He threatens local villagers with reprisals if they aid the Australians. Nothing works. The problem is terrain. New Britain's interior is some of the most hostile jungle on Earth. Thick rainforest, razor-sharp kunai grass, swamps, cliffs, active volcanoes. The Australians know the trails, or rather, their indigenous guides know the trails. The Japanese don't. Every patrol sent into the bush is a nightmare of leeches, malaria, dysentery, and ambushes. Years later, Japanese veterans will describe the terror of patrolling New Britain. You never see the enemy, you just hear the crack of rifle fire and watch your comrades fall. You search for hours and find nothing, except perhaps a few empty shell casings and boot prints leading into impenetrable jungle. For the 28 Australians, the jungle isn't a prison. It's their fortress, it's their ally, and they use it brilliantly. Let's talk about what it actually takes to survive 77 days behind enemy lines in a tropical jungle while conducting guerrilla operations against a force that outnumbers you more than 100 to 1. Food. The Australians live on whatever they can scavenge, hunt, or convince local villagers to share. Wild taro, coconuts, the occasional pig or bird. They're constantly on the edge of starvation, losing weight, fighting malnutrition. Water. Abundant in the jungle, but contaminated. Dysentery becomes a constant companion. Men lose 30, 40, 50 pounds. They develop jungle ulcers, open sores that won't heal in the humid environment. Medicine. Almost none. Malaria is endemic. Every man contracts it multiple times. Without quinine, the fever can kill. They brew makeshift remedies from tree bark. Sometimes it works. Often, it doesn't. Ammunition. This is the critical resource. They start with whatever they carried when Rabaul fell, maybe 100 rounds per rifle, a few grenades. Every shot must count. They scavenge from ambushed Japanese patrols, but ammunition is always desperately scarce. Intelligence. Their greatest weapon. Through the Coastwatcher network and indigenous scouts, they know where Japanese patrols are going. Before the patrols do, they know when supply convoys are vulnerable. They know which roads are lightly guarded. Information keeps them alive. Their strategy is simple. Make the Japanese pay for every mile of New Britain. Never give them security. Never let them feel safe. Force them to dedicate hundreds of soldiers to guard duty and patrol duty soldiers who could otherwise be fighting at Guadalcanal or New Guinea. It's asymmetric warfare at its finest. The Australians don't need to win. They just need to not lose. And every day they survive is a day the Japanese can't fully use Rabaul as a base. By May 1942, the small Australian force has been operating for over 3 months. They're exhausted, half-starved, ravaged by disease. Their ammunition is nearly gone. Several men have died from wounds, illness, or Japanese ambushes. The survivors are reaching their breaking point. And then something changes. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May 4th 8th 1942. For the first time in the war, the Japanese Navy suffers a strategic defeat. Their planned invasion of Port Moresby is turned back by American and Australian naval forces. The tide in the Pacific just barely begins to shift. At Rabaul, Japanese commanders receive new orders: consolidate, defend. The aggressive expansion pauses. Forces are redirected to Guadalcanal, where an American invasion in August will trigger a brutal 6-month campaign. For the Australian guerrillas, this means slightly less pressure. The massive sweeps through the jungle become less frequent. The Japanese, stretched thin across the Pacific, can't spare as many troops for anti-guerrilla operations. But it also means something else. The war is moving on. The strategic importance of their resistance is diminishing. The question becomes, how long can they hold out? And more importantly, is anyone coming to rescue them? June 15th, 1942. After months of radio silence, the Coastwatcher station receives a message from Australian headquarters. Submarines are being dispatched to evacuate survivors from New Britain. Rendezvous coordinates are provided. The pickup window is narrow, just 3 nights. The men have a choice: try to reach the evacuation point and escape, or stay and continue the fight. Most choose to try for evacuation. They've fought for 77 days. They've done everything humanly possible. It's time to go home. The evacuation site is on the southern coast of New Britain, over 50 miles from their current position through Japanese-held territory. The men split into small groups to avoid detection. They travel only at night, moving through the darkest, most difficult jungle routes. Indigenous guides lead the way, local men and women who have risked their lives for months to help the Australians. Without them, escape would be impossible. They know every trail, every stream, every place to hide when Japanese patrols approach. The journey takes nearly a week. Multiple close calls with Japanese patrols. One group is nearly discovered when they stumble into a Japanese camp in the dark. They freeze, absolutely silent, as guards walk within feet of their hiding spots. After what feels like hours, the patrol moves on. Another group has to cross a river swollen by rain. They build makeshift rafts from logs and vines, float across in the darkness, nearly lose their weapons to the current. Several men are too sick to walk. Their comrades carry them. June 21st, 1942. Night. The evacuation point. A remote beach, accessible only by jungle trails. The men emerge from the trees and scan the dark ocean. Nothing. No submarine. No signal. Did the Navy forget them? Did the sub get sunk? Were the coordinates wrong? They wait. Hours pass. Some men weep. Others pray. They've come so far. And then, offshore, a dark shape breaks the surface. A periscope. Then, a conning tower. An Australian submarine, likely HMAS Orsova or a similar vessel, surfaces just beyond the reef. The men wade into the surf. Inflatable boats paddle toward them. Within minutes, they're being pulled aboard, hauled down hatches, given water and food, and blankets. The submarine commander looks at these scarecrows men who've lost 50 pounds, covered in sores and scars, eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen," he says quietly. "You're going home." But not everyone escapes that night. Some men are too far away to reach the evacuation point. Some are too sick to move. And a few, a very few, choose to stay. The Coastwatcher network must continue. Intelligence from New Britain is too valuable to abandon, so several soldiers and civilian volunteers remain behind, hidden in the jungle, broadcasting enemy movements to Allied forces. These men will continue operating for months, some for over a year. They'll watch as Rabaul grows into Japan's largest base in the South Pacific, over 100,000 troops stationed there by 1943. 5 airfields, hundreds of aircraft, massive supply dumps, and they'll report every detail. When the Allies bomb Rabaul in massive air raids throughout 1943 and 1944, the targeting data comes from Coastwatchers hiding in the jungle counting planes, mapping installations, risking death every time they crank their radio generators. Several will be captured and executed. Others will die of disease, but their intelligence will save thousands of Allied lives and contribute directly to the eventual neutralization of Rabaul as a threat. The men who evacuated in June 1942 fought for 77 days. The men who stayed fought for 3 years. Both groups deserve to be remembered as heroes. The 28 Australian soldiers who held off thousands of Japanese troops for 77 days returned to Australia as ghosts. They're emaciated, disease-ridden, some weighing less than 100 pounds. Many spend months in military hospitals recovering from malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and psychological trauma. The Australian government initially keeps their story quiet. Morale is fragile in 1942. Japanese submarines are shelling Sydney. Darwin has been bombed. Invasion seems imminent. The government doesn't want to publicize how close the Japanese came to total victory at Rabaul. But gradually, the story emerges. Newspaper articles, radio interviews, official commendations. The men become symbols of Australian resilience, the idea that a small force, properly motivated and cleverly led, can defy overwhelming odds. Several receive decorations, distinguished service orders, military crosses, military medals. But the greatest recognition comes from their comrades, the thousands of other Australian soldiers who hear the story and draw inspiration from it. As for Rabaul, it remains in Japanese hands until the end of the war. But the Allies adopt a strategy of isolation rather than invasion, surrounding the base, bombing it relentlessly, cutting it off from supply. By 1945, over 90,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors are trapped at Rabaul, effectively removed from the war without a costly invasion. When Japan surrenders in September 1945, the Rabaul garrison is still intact, still heavily armed, having never been defeated in ground combat. But they've also accomplished nothing, isolated, starved, bombed into irrelevance. The strategy the 28 Australians pioneered: harassment, intelligence gathering, making the enemy pay for every inch, has been vindicated on a massive scale. Today, the Siege of Rabaul and the guerrilla resistance that followed are studied in military academies worldwide as examples of asymmetric warfare, small unit tactics, and the importance of intelligence networks. The Coastwatcher organization is recognized as one of World War II's most successful intelligence operations, directly contributing to Allied victories at the Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, and throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. And the 28 men whose names include soldiers like Bill Harry, Tom Axford, David Hutchinson Smith, and many others whose identities remain uncertain due to incomplete records, are remembered as exemplars of courage and resourcefulness. What makes their story remarkable isn't just the tactical achievement, though that's impressive enough. It's the human dimension. These weren't superhumans. They were ordinary young men, clerks, farmers, factory workers who found themselves in an impossible situation and chose to fight rather than surrender. They had every reason to quit. They were outnumbered. They were starving. They were sick. No one would have blamed them for giving up. But they didn't. For 77 days, they held the line. They proved that numbers aren't everything, that determination and ingenuity can overcome material disadvantage, that a small group of committed individuals can make a strategic difference. We must also honor the indigenous Papua New Guineans who made this resistance possible, the scouts who guided the Australians through the jungle, the villagers who shared food when they had almost nothing, the Coastwatcher assistants who risked execution to help operate radio equipment. These men and women fought alongside the Australians, facing the same dangers, showing the same courage. For too long, their contributions were overlooked. Today, we recognize them as equal partners in this remarkable story, of resistance and survival. In Rabaul today, the scars of war remain visible. Rusted Japanese artillery pieces emerge from the jungle. Tunnels dug by forced labor still honeycomb the hills. War cemeteries hold the remains of soldiers from multiple nations. And somewhere in those jungles, perhaps, the spirits of 28 Australian soldiers still stand watch, reminding us that courage isn't about winning. Sometimes, courage is simply refusing to give up, when giving up would be easy. 28 soldiers, 4,000 Japanese troops, 77 days. Against all odds, the 28 held. This documentary is dedicated to the soldiers of Lark Force, the Coastwatchers of the Southwest Pacific, and the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea who fought and died resisting Japanese occupation. Lest we forget,